people with shared interest and people from the scholarly community. So I really encourage you to participate. Please use the chat. You can introduce yourself. We have so many wonderful colleagues from all over the world. And we will have the session first with Mrinalini, afterwards Professor Joachim Bautze, the former head of Asian art of the University of Heidelberg, who has also done a lot of research on European painting in the 18th and 19th century, as well as on the Begum Samru. He will be responding to the talk and lead over to the questions. If you have a question, I would be grateful if you could just write a Q in front of the question, so that will be easier for us to find your question from the comments. So, Begum Samru is a fascinating person. And I think the danger with these fascinating people is that sometimes people working on such interesting people can be talking about the anecdotal or too much of a descriptive part of her life, because it's so intriguing in a way, putting this puzzle together of so many diverse aspects of her life. And I think the other danger is that we are too speculative in talking about her. And when I came across Mrinalini's work, I thought it was a really nice kind of measured way of looking at facts, looking at interesting theory. Especially, I enjoyed the aspect of the cosmopolitan in looking at her life, and particularly the material culture. The Center for Historic Houses is interested primarily in secular architecture, research on historic houses, but we also create various cultural events to support historic houses, the privately owned historic houses of India. And I think the difficulty with historic houses is the many different narratives, looking at the architecture, looking at the people who built it, the people who commissioned it, the people who lived in the buildings, the art, the decorative arts, the socioeconomic history of it. And looking at all of these narratives, I think, is important to understand and to bring these histories back to life. And if we only choose one narrative, then it can be misleading because we leave other narratives out. And I think this is the huge challenge. Begum Samru was a woman who rose from obscurity to prominence, and she left an important architectural legacy behind. Some of it is in shambles, and others are still standing. Her extraordinary life from not girl, as many sources describe, to wife of a German-born mercenary who eventually became a military commander herself is an unusual life story. A convert from Islam to Catholicism, she was participating in many different worlds. But maybe these many different worlds and the possibility of leading so many different worlds at this particular time is a trait of the time itself. And this is something we can explore in this webinar today. Her life is both unique and also tells the story of her age. She was participating in Hindu, Islamic, and Christian festivities and mixed freely in what can be described as a cosmopolitan circle of French, German, British, Hindu, Islamic, Sikh, and Jain members of other cultures in India. She offered military protection to both the British and the Emperor Shah Alam, who also bestowed the name Zeb-ul-Nisa on her. And this is another aspect we can explore today, the difficulty of finding the right names, having so many different names for her, but also for the buildings. How shall we refer to these buildings? What name should we use? Should we use a palace, a mansion? What is the correct terminology, the correct typology? How can we talk about this history? Her early life was obscure, although many sources suggest that she was a Nautch girl, both associated with refined femininity, etiquette, and artful living, as well as sexuality. And we can see in some of the paintings and in some of her work that she was actually employing these associations by organizing these various cultural events in the historic houses, where the historic house served as a platform, as a theater set in a way, for staging these various intentions and strategies that she was using. And she also orchestrated and had other girls perform these Nautch dances for the Europeans who were visiting these historic houses. She nevertheless adopted several masculine traits, from the management of estates to military and diplomatic prowess. And several of the visual sources indicate these masculine traits, from smoking the hookah to the turban, for example. She seemed to have been aware of these gender roles and transgressions at the same time. In a letter cited in Banerjee's biography of 1925, the Begum is supposed to have said, "Does your prince possess manly and heroic qualities? I meant to ask whether he possessed the capacity to play the sword and win kingdoms, or does he only have a passion for playing on the drum in Tabor?" We have many contemporary sources from travelers, from autobiographies, who have many different ways of referring to her. Some call her shrewd, scheming, power hungry. How do we deal with these sources? Are these accurate descriptions, or are these more or less describing certain ideas that display their own prejudice? All of these are really difficult things to deal with. And I'm looking forward to Mrinalini's talk to look at all of these aspects in the context of material culture and architecture. And later, maybe if we have the time, I recently found that Begum Samru is still present in commercial culture today. I found a Begum Samru puzzle, and I found a Begum Samru collection of Ayush Kasliwal, who's actually a very famous designer who studied at NID and has a beautiful design studio in Jaipur. So if we have the time, we can have a look at this. And of course, she also inspired plays and books in the 19th century, from Jules Verne to also some Austrian writers, such as Friedrich Halm, who actually wrote a play in 1860 dedicated to Begum Samru. So it's really interesting to look at all these different cultural worlds and aesthetic worlds associated with the biography of this extraordinary woman. So thank you very much, Mrinalini, for being here. Also, you, Achim, you have been both really fantastic in being so enthusiastic about working together with the center, and it was not complicated at all and really wonderful. So please, let's welcome you, and please, if you could start your presentation now. Thank you.
Sure, let me try to share my screen. Is that visible to everybody?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. And can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great, sorry. Zoom is. Thank you. I wanted to thank both Dr. Schmidt and Professor Bautzer for being here and for this wonderful invitation. And I just have to say that I am so impressed at the sort of organizational skills of Dr. Schmidt, particularly, that she was able to put this together at such short notice. And thank you all for coming. I know that it's a little late in India, and I do hope that you're all very safe and healthy during this difficult time in India and in the rest of the world. So I wanted to say that before I begin, I wanted to put forward 2 points of introduction about myself, and to say that I am an immigrant to the United States, and I name myself as such to stand in solidarity with all others who come to this country seeking the same opportunities that I did. And I also want to let you know that today I'm speaking to you from the city of Pittsburgh, or Onondaga, which is the Seneca language name for the Pittsburgh region. This city was built on the unceded and ancestral lands of many indigenous peoples, including the Seneca Nation, members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, before those nations were dispossessed by white settler colonialism. So I wanted to talk a little bit, as Dr. Schmidt said, about my ongoing project. I'm in the middle of writing this book about Begum Samru, and I really see this as a creative biography of the Begum. As Dr. Schmidt said, there is quite a bit of both good and bad history about Begum Samru. Some of it, particularly written earlier in the 20th century, was sort of more, or in the middle of the 20th century, was a little bit more pulpy and a little bit more sort of, focused on the sort of salacious aspects of the Begum's life, of which there are many. And recently there have been also more solid biographies of the Begum. I would direct you to the book called Sardhana by Julia Key as a quite important historical work. But my interest in doing this is to really kind of think about the Begum as a creative agent and how we can think about the creative process of her creative agency through both her architecture as well as the art that she patronized and commissioned through her life. So I'm really kind of interested in that aspect of the Begum's life. So what I'm going to do today, and please forgive me, I've written this up, but I'm sort of trying to do this while I'm in the middle of the book. So I'm going to give you a glimpse of the Begum's art and architecture today, but feel free to ask questions and at the end of the talk, and I can fill you in on things that that you may need more information on. So really what I want to talk about, the kernel of my talk today is really to think about the Begum's two residences as a kind of diplomatic infrastructure. So they were residences, but these were the places where she created connections and political alliances between herself and her many sort of political allies. So that's really the sort of aspect of the architecture that I'll be focusing on most today. And I would say that's the sort of argument that I'm going to be making. So let me present a brief biographical sketch of the Begum, and I'm going to be mostly focusing on her two major residences that are still extant in some form or the other. To the left of your screens, you should see Begum Samru's residence in Delhi, which was completed in 1810. And then to the right of the screen is the Begum Samru's residence in Sardhana, which was completed around 1834. And I'll just briefly also touch a little bit on the Begum's church, because that was an important aspect. I think it was an important transitionary moment in her architectural portfolio, if you will. So I'll talk a little bit about the church, and the church is a fascinating structure as well. So before that, a brief biography. We know actually very little in terms of fact about the Begum's life. Several of her European contemporaries claim that she was raised in the company of courtesans and had been a nachni, or a dancer, in Mughal Delhi. And at the age of 14, she enters the harem of Walter Reinhardt, who you see here, an Austrian who had arrived on shore in India in the 1750s. And Reinhardt had jumped ship and gone on to manage a powerful mercenary army in India. During his time in India, Reinhardt acquired the moniker of Somber, a name given to him by the English, it is said, either due to the overly serious demeanor that he had, or due to the pallor of his complexion. It's not sure. And there's also some records that say that Somber was a corruption of his original German surname, Summers. On one of his mercenary missions, when he was in the employ of an Indian ruler, Reinhardt had killed several European officers of the English East India Company. This is the massacre at Patna that actually went down in infamy later on. The East India Company, the English East India Company, put a price on Reinhardt's head, and he lived the rest of his life on the lam. Somber was then also the nickname that prevailed, possibly when Reinhardt's other title, the Butcher of Patna, was proving a little difficult to roll off the tongue. Somber, said in the Indian patois, quickly became Samru, and this is the name that the young Begum inherited when Reinhardt died in 1778. After his death, the Begum inherited Reinhardt's standing army, as well as the territories that he had been given as a reward for his mercenary services to various Indian rulers. The Begum expanded the army, and it quickly gained a reputation for being a disciplined and well-trained brigade. In 1803, the Begum struck a deal with the English East India Company. She would allow them exclusive use of her mercenary army in return for sovereignty over her territory. Sardhana, the capital of her territory, was in the fertile Indo-Gangetic plain known as the Doab, so the land of two rivers. So this is Delhi here, marked by this red star, and Sardhana is just a little bit north east of Delhi. And you can see here in these two maps, you can see the sort of power of the English East India Company really extending in a very short period. I mean, this is during really this time period when Begum Samru comes into Reinhardt's harem, and by the time that she actually receives this, makes this allegiance with the East India Company and becomes an ally of them, you can see how the British are really kind of pushing into the territory of the Doab, with Delhi as being that kind of, Delhi and Lahore being the kind of sort of the terminus of that sort of interest, that political interest, expansionist interest. Assured of her political rights, circa 1805, the Begum began, and so sorry, I wanted to show you this map. This is Sardhana, marked here, just a little bit north of Delhi. So assured of her political rights, the Begum began an extensive building project that would last about 30 years until the end of her life. And I wanted to show you a little bit about the sort of the line of descent here between the Begum and her heir, whom she would eventually adopt. That heir is actually biologically from Walter Reinhardt's first wife, his major wife, Buddy Bibi, who had a son, Aloysius Balthazar Reinhardt, who had a daughter who was married to George Dice, and these three children were born from that line of descent. Notice here too that Begum Samru takes on this name from Reinhardt, and David Dice also takes on the Begum's name actually at this point, not so much his biological sort of great-grandfather's life. So assured of her political rights, the Begum began an extensive building project that would last about 30 years until the end of her life. She also commissioned numerous portraits of herself and her male European contemporaries that she either gifted to her allies or displayed as a decor in one of her two mansions. The Begum converted to Catholicism in 1781. So this is 3 years after Reinhardt dies, she converts to Catholicism. And she made several donations to Catholic and Protestant institutions, which gained her a reputation for being as generous as she was wealthy. And again, I just wanted to go back to that slide and say that the Begum had no biological children of her own. So this is the reason that it is one of the reasons that she decides to adopt David Dice Somber much later in her life, when she's actually in her 70s. There's one other important biographical detail of the Begum which is worth mentioning here. Around the same time that she was given the right to rule from Sardhana, the Begum appears to have gone from being in parda, the practice of veiling, to appearing in public and presenting her image as an unveiled woman. This moment of unveiling, the Begum stepping into a public persona, accompanied the beginning of her building program, including the 3 major architectural commissions that I will discuss today. In chronological order, these are the residence in Delhi, the Mughal imperial capital, the Catholic Church in her territory of Sardhana, and this last residence also in Sardhana. And all of these buildings were built between 1810 and 1834, towards the end of the Begum's life and reign. The Begum owned at least 2 mansions in the walled city of Delhi, in addition to parcels of land outside of Shah Jahanabad. The older mansion in Delhi was off of Rasta Churiwala, or Bangle Sellers Lane, and it remained in the possession of the Begum until her death, when she bequeathed it to Dai Somber. And again, we don't know if she actually built this Haveli or if she inherited this Haveli, or if it was something that was sort of partially done by her as such. The only information that we have of this mansion is from a map of Delhi made around 1850, which shows the mansion as a walled structure with a generous courtyard in front of it, and buffered from the street. Despite the modest size of the Begum's house and the dense urban fabric surrounding it, the Begum does seem to be in the company of well-heeled neighbors. Her immediate neighbor, Raja Sohanlal, had a street, a kucha, a hatta or a market, and a large field khana or elephant stables named after him. And this indicates obviously his wealth and elevated social standing in the city. There's unfortunately no remnant of this building in contemporary Delhi today. More famous was the Begum's later mansion, which I will spend the greater deal of today talking about, on Chandni Chowk. The main urban artery of Shah Jahanabad that led to the Lahore Gate of Red Fort was where the Begum Samru's mansion was located. So this is Chandni Chowk that you see here, and this is the Darwaza Begum Samru that leads to this, excuse me, very large estate and mansion of hers. A 19th century map of the walled city of Delhi shows this is the south facade of the Begum's mansion, and this is this is the south facade facing Chandni Chowk, and this is the north facade facing to the back. Sorry. The Begum's estate, a 19th century map of the walled city of Delhi, shows the prominent position of this Begum's second mansion in relation to the Red Fort. So this is the Begum's mansion, and this is the Red Fort, the Chandni Chowk, and Jama Masjid. And the British residents, British East India the English East India Company's residence house and garden. So this is the estate of Begum Samru. This is the Jama Masjid, and this is the English East India Company's residence and quarters, and this is, of course, the Red Fort. So you can see how closely connected they are. The Begum's estate was remarkable not only for its large scale, comparable to the British residence quarters, but also its proximity to the 2 major powers, so the East India Company and the Mughals controlling Delhi at this time. This mansion was actually built on land gifted to the Begum by the Emperor Akbar Shah II, whose own imperial residence was, of course, at the Red Fort. And we actually have a poetic account of the Mughal emperor's visit to the Begum's house on the occasion of its inauguration. This was around, so she receives this land in 1806, and then she builds the house, around 1810. The Begum's biographer, and this is another view of the Begum's house, and you can see really the extent of the estates and the sort of prominence of the house, and this artist having rendered the busyness of the Chandni Chowk and the Red Fort, but also the Jama Masjid, and then sort of positioning the Begum's house almost as a kind of counterpart of the imperial mosque on the Chandni Chowk. So we have a poetic account of the Emperor Akbar Shah coming to the Begum's house during this sort of celebration or inauguration of her house in Delhi. The Begum's biographer, Lala Gokul Chand, describes the celebration in very florid verse. And this is a translation from Nicholas Shreve, and it's a little bit ditty-like, so please forgive me. But he says, from the entrance through the garden laid, a carpet that from silk and gold was made. So many precious items were assembled, they cargo from 100 ships resembled. Khilats were ceremonial robes. Khilats, jewels, silver, gold, and more, each guest provided from this generous store. The food and drink purveyed for delectation were prodigal, defying all description. Dancing thrilled and music sounded, songs like nightingales resounded. The emperor, filled with pleasure and delight, gave many thanks for that most wondrous night. And you can see here in this image that there's a procession coming from the side of the Red Fort. So this would be from that. I'm sorry. So this is so this is the eastern side, and then also a carriage of European style coming from the other side. So this is really an indication of the. And we can't read this painting as a document of that particular event, but it's really interesting to see how the Begum's house is this kind of background to this very energetic scene of arrivals and anticipation. And you can see this in this busy forecourt. And from the right, which is the direction of the Red Fort, so the Red Fort would be around here, we see two elephants approaching the gate of the Begum's mansion. And you can see that they have these rich red caparisons, and they have gold rings on their tusks and ornaments on their forehead, which really, indicate that they are part of a kind of a royal entourage. And from the other side of the street, a European carriage approaches, bearing visitors of some note. And we don't know who this artist is, but we can say that maybe they're being a little bit on the nose to divide the space of the Chandni Chowk equally between the two major allies of the Begum. So you have the rising European powers, the English East India Company, and the waning Mughals. And Akbar Shah himself, Akbar Shah II, was in a very precarious position with the English East India Company, almost a puppet ruler of the English East India Company. And at the way at the top of this painting, you see the Begum sort of looking down on this kind of very vibrant courtyard of hers, the kind of large estate. So she's surveying the scene from up there, and she's really the single woman within this kind of vast crew of men, and very important men, her own position being recognized as important and certainly the proprietor of this, her position as a proprietor of this mansion being recognized by the artist by placing her on top. The Begum's mansion in Delhi was noted as amongst the finest residences in India, and it served both as her domicile and her court when she visited the imperial capital. Perhaps the best known painting of the Begum, which is now at the Chester Beatty Library, is labeled The Household of Begum Samru. But I would like to offer an alternative reading as well as an alternative title for this painting as The Court or Darbar of Begum Samru, rather than her household. Considering the date that this painting was finished, it is likely a representation of the Begum's mansion on the Chandni Chowk. More importantly, the Darbar space in the mansion was likely the long room that was sandwiched between the columned portico and the most spacious banquet or entertainment hall to the back. So I'm sorry, I just have to go back here, but you can see that there's an indication here of this kind of longish room between this kind of the portico that comes from the front and a more generous space that was used for entertaining and banquets and such. Architectural historian Sylvia Shorto has shown that 19th century European residences in Delhi incorporated darbar halls into their designs. These spaces were key for East India Company officials to stage themselves in the style of the Mughal emperor, who held daily darbars, and this was part of the choreography of empire. And Ebba Koch and Catherine Asher have talked greatly about the sort of the spatial, but also the ritual sense of viewing the Mughal emperor and such. The Begum was keenly aware of darbar etiquette herself and had likely fashioned this room as a mini court for herself. And we have another indication that this was not the household so much of the Begum Samru, but it actually was the court, from an inscription that actually appears here on top of this pediment of this doorway, which says Shabir Begum Sahib Riyaz Zaman Salamat, which means the likeness of the respected Begum who offers redress to the world, praise to her. And this is really interesting. This word redress was one that was often used to indicate the function of the darbar, that people came, subjects of the ruler came looking for redress. They offered petitions, they asked for advice, they asked for counsel. And it was the ruler's prerogative, certainly the Mughal emperor's prerogative, to provide that redress. So it's very indicative that that is the inscription that appears right above the Begum's head. So you can see that it's positioned directly on top of her. In contradiction to its current title, then, this painting is not a representation of the Begum's household, but rather a self-conscious presentation of her darbar. And I should also say that in my research, I've actually uncovered that the Begum's household was made of as many women as it was of men. So the Begum had a large extended household of women that she took care of, that she arranged marriages for with her. And these were not necessarily women that she was related to by blood. Some of them she was related to by marriage because they were David Dice's sisters. But others were women that she took care of, like Badi Bibi, who actually outlived the Begum, so David Dice's great-grandmother. So the Begum's household was also this kind of cosmopolitan mix of Portuguese women, concubines of David Dice, other women who were multiracial women, etc. But this is not that household. This is definitely not a description of that household. And most of the women in the Begum's household also maintained parda, including the multiracial European and Indian women. So the clue for this representation, for the interpretation of this painting as the court of Begum Samru, or the darbar of Begum Samru, lies in the term riyas, which means redress, and was the central function of a darbar, which was a forum that provided redress for the ruler's subjects. In this painting, the Begum appears at the center of an image from which her kin, trusted advisors, and courtiers and military officers are arranged in terms of rank around her. So to her right-hand side, you see David Dice, who was by that point her adopted heir. And to the left, you see his father. So that's the kind of genealogical connection. This is George Dice. To the other side, you'll see this was John Sahib, who was the son of George Thomas, an Irish mercenary whose wife and children also lived in the Begum's mansion. So again, talking about this kind of very cosmopolitan, extended household. This is and the arrangement of the Begum's court is very much, takes on the visual tropes of a Mughal darbar scene. So her most intimate advisors and her confidants are to the center, closest to her own body. And then the people of lesser rank, or their rank diminishes as the distance between them grows. I just want to point out that this is the Begum's biographer, Lala Gopal Chand, whose the translations of whose work I'm relying on, and arranged here on this kind of diagonal and pointing sort of towards the Begum's body are four visiting dignitaries from a foreign court. Not a foreign court, but we think that they were from the court of Awadh or some sort of regional court who had come to see the Begum. And you can see the sort of, the similarities between the Begum's darbar and the sort of similar darbar portraits of Akbar Shah II, who is her contemporary, of course. And this is Akbar Shah with his princes, who are again arranged here. And this is Akbar Shah with the British residents. So you can again see that sort of semicircular kind of fan shape with the rank and position of each person being discernible by how close they are to the emperor. Now, it's very common when talking about the Begum or many powerful women of her ilk to say that they were adopting and co-opting male tropes of power, which they certainly were. But I also want to say something else here, and I want to offer a sort of a feminist intervention here by saying that women were also, darbar spaces were also very much used by women, not just by men, so especially powerful women of rank. So women also held court in their quarters, and darbar rooms were particularly prevalent in courtesans' establishments. So in the Tawaif's quarters. So if the Begum had spent her early life as a Tawaif or a courtesan, then she would have been surely been familiar with the spatial and visual potency of the darbar. So consider, for example, this painting by Ghulam Ali Khan, which shows the interior of a kota, which is a courtesan's establishment, possibly in Delhi or in Lucknow. The curators of the San Diego Museum of Art, where this painting currently resides, have offered one interpretation of this image that rather than showing 6 different women, it is in fact a representation of the courtesan's life cycle. So moving anti-clockwise from the bottom left, you find the young ingenue who seems unsure of herself and a little bit sort of uncomfortable in her own sexuality. She matures quickly to the lithe dancer, striking a pose, to possibly singers and poets who are flanking the main character. And then at the center of the court of the painting is the Tawaif at the prime of her life. She's looking out self-confidently at the viewer. Her jewels and this very opulent clothing are markers of her sexual, intellectual, and creative prowess. And to the extreme left of the painting is the wizened Chaudrayan. She's too old to be seductress, but now she assumes the role of the matriarch of the establishment. And notice too the opulence of the kota. So these women clearly run a wealthy establishment. There's a large pankha overhead. There's glassware arranged in niches, which was also a sign of wealth and cultured taste. And there's a large columned entrance leading to a courtyard, all of this implies that these are women of means. More importantly, this space, the kota, was the space. This was their space because men were merely transitory visitors here. Kotas were passed along in matrilineal descent from one tawaif to the other, and women had and the courtesans had inalienable rights to these properties. So comparing the Begum's darbar to Ghulam Ali Khan's portrait of the darbar, comparing the Begum's darbar to Ghulam Ali Khan's painting of the kota, we see here the familiar arrangement of a darbar. The chief protagonist is positioned at the center, while her associates are arranged by rank and importance around her. These visual representations of courtly etiquette, spatial arrangements of bodies vis-a-vis power, really dissolve the kind of boundaries between domestic space and the sort of royal court. And the kota really is a form of an audience hall, and the darbar as well, a space where power was both spatially arranged and communicated. And so what I'm trying to say here in the sort of broader sort of history of things is that the Begum is operating both within male traditions of power, but also between female traditions of power in Delhi at this time, Delhi and North India at this time. That the tendency here should not be just flatten the Begum's experience or history and to say that she's simply acting as a man or she's, entirely masculinizing herself, that there were also local forms of female power that she was clearly familiar with and possibly drawing on. So I want to just have a little bit of an interlude here, and just to sort of sum up this is the view of the Begum's house from Chandni Chowk. This is from the back of the house, and you can see this kind of this very large estate that was a part of the Begum's property. So just a little interlude. I want to talk a little bit about the church in Sardhana before I return to the final residence of the Begum. In January 1834, Pope Gregory the 16th received a letter from Begum Samru, a sovereign ruler of her territory in North India. The devoutly Catholic Begum had sent 150,000 rupees or 30,700 sterling pounds as a donation to the church. And an excerpt from the letter, and you can see the front of this letter here, which is from the archives. She says, "I also take this opportunity of providing Your Holiness a large picture of my new church, which has been entirely built by me and which I have dedicated to the Holy Virgin Mary." So she sends a painting to Pope Gregory, and it was probably the original of this facsimile, which is currently in India. And it shows her presenting a gold chalice to the Bishop Pezzoni on the occasion of the consecration of her church. And after outlining her numerous donations to Catholic institutions in England and India, amounting to approximately 1 million rupees, Begum Samru made a request of Pope Gregory. Would he send over some relics for this magnificent church that she had built? The Pope replied promptly, and addressing her as the most beloved daughter in Christ, he sent several relics for her church, including a relic of the True Cross. And I'm bringing this up, and she also, I wanted to say, she also sent a lithograph paintings, lithographs of the front facade and plans of her church to Pope Gregory. I'm sorry, I don't have this. I've been asking the British Library to photograph these, but they've been in lockdown during the pandemic, so I don't have a visual record of those. But this is to say that she's really kind of advertising. She's not content with simply just building the church, but also she wants to show the extent and the grandiosity of this church. And I want to show you some of the sort of images of the church. This would have been the main entrance. It is no longer the main entrance of the church. It has an inscription that in Persian, as well as a smaller inscription here, on top of the door here, that says that Begum Samru was the patron of this church, and it uses her Catholic name, actually, Ioanna Nobilis, to indicate her Catholic faith. The church was built by Antonio Regalini, who had come into the Begum's employ circa 1813, and he was from Vicenza, which is very well known for its kind of Palladian architecture, and you can certainly see some of the Palladian influences, particularly in that kind of grand, sprawling sort of facade, which actually sort of exaggerates the size of the congregation hall inside the church. And just some other sort of views of the church. And this was really, I mean, to mark Sardhana with such a grand structure was a very bold move by the Begum, but it was also necessary because Sardhana was really a kind of a backwater, right? It didn't have the kind of imperial freight of a city like Delhi. It didn't have the kind of value or the prestige of a presidency town like Calcutta. It didn't have the cultural importance of a city like Lucknow. So, this was really the Begum's way of, in some ways, if I can really invent a word now, cosmopolitanizing this kind of backwater that she was now the sort of, so really to kind of make it into a kind of central node. And all the time that she is building this, the Begum is living in various places. So she has a couple of houses in Meerut. She's spending a lot of time in Meerut because Meerut is a cantonment town of the English East India Company. So political business, but also friendships take her there quite often. So she's really not, besides the church, she's not investing so much in her house architecture. And at least from what I can glean from the archives, it seems that she was quite content to live in various domestic residences. There's a small house, or there's a small mansion that is now the St. John's Seminary, which is very close to the church, actually it's opposite the church, that she was also using as a residence in Sardhana. She spent, like many late Mughal men and women, she spent a lot of time in tents. Often she conducted her darbars and received visitors in tents pitched outside of the pakka structure of her houses. So that is also a living space that we have to consider as part of the Begum's residential history, if you will. And it really seems like she's not interested very much in building until very late in her life, when she builds this very grand mansion also in Sardhana. And my take on this residence is that she's building this when she's 84 years old. Between 83 and 84 years old. She would pass away only 2 years later. She's quite feeble and frail at this time, and she knows that the end is coming. And she mentions this quite a lot in her sort of, in the archival record makes a mention of this, and also in her correspondence to her friends and such. So my take on this last residence of the Begum is that it was largely built for her adopted heir, so the great-grandson, so this is David Dice, great-grandson of Walter Reinhardt, to whom the Begum would leave her legacy. According to the deal that the Begum had struck with the English East India Company in 1803, upon her death, all of her territories and revenue-generating lands would immediately pass on to the company. The only inheritance she could give to her heir and other beneficiaries were her personal property in the form of houses, in the form of cash endowments, jewelry, etc. So the need to make investments in a large residence that could be gifted to Dicember was made more urgent by the fact that he had proven to be quite politically incompetent and administratively a bit lazy. He had shown not an iota of the ambition, cunning, or intelligence that had catapulted the Begum from Tawaif to ruler of her sovereign territory. This residence then was to ensure not only Dicember's comfort, but also position him squarely as the Begum's heir long after her death. So, I mean, again, in the book, the larger claim that I'm making, that she is really kind of creating a legacy for herself through him, but it's not Reinhardt's legacy. It's her sort of genealogy that she's now perpetuating through him. In addition, I contend that this residence at Sardhana was also meant to serve as a living archive for the Begum after her death. It was meant to be an architectural record of her own political history and diplomatic connections that she had forged across the globe. A house for her heir, certainly, but also a monument for herself. And one clue about the Begum's intentions to memorialize herself thus comes from the considerable collection of portraits of herself and her European male allies that were displayed at the Begum's residence. So I just wanted to show you the layout of the Begum's residence, and you can see some similarities between the Delhi residence, in the sense that there's this very generous veranda portico, which leads into this very sort of, again, very generous space. I have not found any indications that the Begum held darbars in this particular residence, but certainly it's possible that she imagined that maybe Dicember would hold darbars or such, but that is this space. And then again, a very large space for where she held banquets and notches, and a kind of a large room for really for hosting her guests. So one clue about the Begum's intentions to memorialize herself thus comes from the considerable collections of portraits that were displayed at the Begum's residence. Sorry, my slides are all over the place. So approximately 25 paintings of various European officials and the Begum hung in the 3 salons at the front of the house. Some of these were a portrait of the Begum seated on a throne and holding a hookah, a portrait of Dai Somber as a child, an enormous equestrian portrait of British resident at Delhi, Sir David Ochterlony, a copy of the painting that the Begum had sent to Pope Gregory at the consecration of her church. And of these 25 paintings, these are 25 recorded paintings, only 4 featured the Begum, but these were significantly larger than the others and prominently featured in the central hall. So again, that Darbar hall, or the kind of major sort of formal hall. All of the other portraits were of European men or members of the Begum's court or church. Many of these, and certainly the examples that you see here, were painted by Raja Jivan Ram, who was an artist who was frequently in the Begum's employ. Raja Jivan Ram also painted for Ranjit Singh, who was the Sikh ruler of Punjab. It may be surmised that the Begum had commissioned these portraits of herself and her closest male allies as a way of, again, enforcing those sort of diplomatic connections, but also leaving them for posterity. By commissioning a portrait, for example, having someone like Commander Deridon sit for a portrait, the Begum would pay for and then display in her mansion was a powerful form of tribute to the sitter. Art historian Molly Aitken has argued that noble women in early modern India often exercise their agency not by being depicted themselves in portraits, but having portraits of their male counterparts commissioned. Aitken speaks of this patronage of male portraiture by Rajput noble women as a way of circumventing parda, the veil. So exercising agency, even if when you're in the veil and you cannot be depicted yourself or memorialized in portraits, then the legacy of these women would be to memorialize the men to whom they were closest, either by descent or by marriage. While the Begum had stopped observing parda many decades ago, these acts of portrait commissioning can be seen in a similar vein. Whom the Begum chose to have painted and whose paintings she hung on the walls of her grand residence could be seen as a compliment to the sitter, certainly. But it was also a record of the vast diplomatic network that she had built during her career as a military woman and a ruler of her sovereign territory. As I mentioned before, the Begum frequently sent portraits of herself as gifts to her allies and counterparts across the world. A year before she died, the Begum sent this portrait of hers to King Louis-Philippe of France. The portrait was made by Raja Jivan Ram and was carried to France by General Allard, a French officer who had earlier served in the Begum's army. Like in her other portraits, the Begum appears stately and strong, occupying the entire frame of the painting. She gazes resolutely at the viewer, and her vibrantly colored shawl and pearl bracelets provide the requisite marks of nobility. On receiving her letter and gift, Louis-Philippe replied to the Begum and praised her Catholic devotion by saying, quote, "Distances are nothing to your charity, which seeks every opportunity to spread in Asia, in Europe, and elsewhere," end of quote. He made special note that her portrait had found a distinguished place in his palace, where it could be looked upon with affection by the French emperor and his family. He writes his letter from the Tuileries, but the painting was actually recorded as hanging at Chateau d'Eu, which was his summer residence, which you see here. Sometime later, there's an inventory of paintings, and it makes a comment about this painting of Begum Samru being at the Chateau d'Eu. Curiously, as soon as Louis-Philippe received this portrait, he also commissioned a French court artist to make a copy of it and have it sent back to India as a present for the Begum. Unfortunately, that painting arrived in India 2 months after the Begum's passing, and I have not been able to locate it as such, located thus far. It is not too much to imagine, however, that if the Begum had received the portrait in time, that it would occupy pride of place amongst others in her last mansion at Sardhana. And if anybody can actually knows anything about this practice of copying portraits in the French court or European courts and sending them back as a kind of a return gift, I would love some more information on this. I haven't figured out how to historically contextualize the sort of replication of the original painting by Jeevan Ram and back. Likewise, the original of the painting that she sent to the Pope, so this painting was recorded as hanging in the Quirinale, the papal residence in Rome. So here you have Sardhana now being connected to Paris and to the Vatican in these kind of very interesting ways. So this town that is a kind of dusty backwater, certainly a very prosperous territory for the Begum, but it really doesn't have that kind of cultural importance, now begins to kind of accrue that sort of visibility and intelligibility for the Begum. In terms of a kind of a worthy sort of capital for the Begum. This may be a fine place to draw a conclusion and a comparison between the Begum's two houses in Delhi and Sardhana. The mansion in Delhi exercises diplomatic potency by its strategic position between the East India Company residency at Delhi and the Mughal Red Fort. The Begum's house in the Chandni Chowk formed one apex of a tight triangle between the English and Indian rulers of Delhi and indeed a large part of North India. The Sardhana mansion, in contrast, was remotely located, and it had to affect these diplomatic connections in another way. It did this through displaying the portraits of the Begum's allies and her powerful male counterparts across the globe, almost in a kind of tableau vivant in the residence. At once domestic residence, darbar, and monument to herself, the Begum made history at home thus. That's it. Thank you. I hope I didn't go too far, go too long.
No, absolutely fantastic. I mean, it's really stunning. I mean, the images, the meticulous research, the analysis. I have lots of questions, but I'd like to hand it over first of all to Dr. Bautze, who will share his reflections with us and lead over then to the Q&A. Thank you so much. Really fantastic. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Mina, for this absolutely overwhelming talk. There were quite a few images that even myself haven't seen before. I was a bit more prepared for the building, especially considering their present day condition. You may know that the so-called Bhagirathi Palace, as it was called, or the former Lloyd's Bank or Indian Bank, today is, to the best of my knowledge, still not a protected monument. I don't know if you have more information, but according to Intec, they have made a big inventory of all the more interesting monuments, including those from the 19th century and even early 20th century. It's not a protected monument. And I have seen it, so to say, in rags, although we have the earlier photographs taken at around 1859 by Felice Beato. It seems that part of it was rebuilt, because in Beato's photographs, you see the stumps of the pillars, which in later views were sort of re-erected. I just have a short remark to make, because maybe this information is useful for your book. You have shown one of the largest so-called miniature paintings on cloth, showing Delhi along the Chandni Chowk. On top of the painting, you see the Shah Jahan Kila, and to the left, you see the you see the garden of the Begum with her house. I think I saw the date about 1820. We have a bit to correct this date. No. Yeah, this one. This painting illustrates the visit of the Maharao of Kota, Maharao Ram Singh of Kota. Some people call him Maharao II, although there was no Maharao first. The first Ram Singh was just with the title Rao. And you see him there on the elephant coming down from Chandni Chowk. And the interesting thing is that you can't enlarge it, as there he is. And all the women of, I don't know, I would call them, you know, maybe Tawives, maybe Nachanis, they are waving towards him. And
wow.
this, pardon? Well, I know this painting quite well because I've seen it in original several times. And the date of the visit, I haven't checked now with the books because your talk was so fascinating, but I think he visited the then Emperor of Delhi in 1843. And we have several preparatory drawings of this visit. I even had published a few, but not from the Begum's garden, but from the Red Fort, the Divan-i Khas, the Divan-i-Am, etc. So this was just a minor remark that I wished it would be that early, but in 1820, Maharao Ram Singh wasn't the king of Kota yet. That was his predecessor, Kishore Singh Ji, who, to the best of my knowledge, never visited Delhi. The other intriguing and most interesting thing is your interpretation of the what we may call the Begum's Darbar, which you think it was taking place at this very house made, or a palace mentioned, made in first in 1810, which might be true, but the more fascinating thing is about this painting, the distribution of the people around her. And because in Indian painting, the first reliable depictions of such darbars, that means darbars where we can name those present during the darbar, they are from Akbar's period. And there's a painting in the Victorian Albert Museum, Akbar Nameh, where you see Akbar and his allies from what I may call the female side, which would line up to the emperor's left. And his own people that he trusted, they were to his right. Even when you see Rajput darbars today, and I have seen and photographed quite a few, it is the same. The male relatives always are to be seen to the right of the ruler, and the female or those relatives who intermarried with the sisters or you know, they are on the left side. So what intrigues me about the Begum's painting is, as you said, she takes over sort of male habits, is how did she, or how did the artist arrange that? Normally, the artist never gave reins to his fantasy when doing such paintings because they were very, very important. We have not innumerable, but we have many Rajput paintings from the rulers of Bundi, the rulers of Kota, the rulers of Jaipur, where we know exactly who is who by genealogy. I just wonder about the painting in the Chester Beatty Library. And when I saw it first time, which is almost 38 years ago, I didn't know what to say. It's an absolute overwhelming painting. I prefer to the procession, because in the procession, she is rather small on the elephant. And there she is in the center. And well, I like your idea, but I would like to know a bit more about your interpretation of the arrangement of the, not of the sitters, as the artist would say, but they all had to stand, of course, and only the Begum was allowed to sit next to her nearest sort of friends and relatives, as we have seen in the painting. But I do not, in case you would like to reply, to answer these questions, it's fine. But otherwise, I do not want to stand in between you and all those who have questions. So, Mimi, what do you suggest? What should we do? Because the time seems to be up. I don't know if you have time.
We have a little bit of time because it's too interesting now. We have this wonderful opportunity to discuss. So yes, Mrinalini, perhaps you would like to talk about this. And of course, in this context, I would also like to ask, we saw, it's not very visible, but there are chairs, of course, in the painting with Begum Samru and kind of Regency chairs. So it's interesting, we have the neoclassical house, but we have many Mughal features such as the rug and the hookah. And she also has this footstool. So I'd like to know whether you also would interpret the footstool as a sign of power in a way, and the hookah as a kind of male phenomenon, although I've seen a number of Indian miniature paintings of women also smoking the hookah. So initially I thought it was primarily male, but there are these depictions. Yes, and of course, if you compare this with the Durbar that you also showed in the, was it the Red Fort, or, you don't have any European furniture. So there is, more going on there. But if you compare the interiors of Begum's house with other interiors of the time of British houses, for example, let's say in Calcutta, I'm thinking of the Lady Impey house. I actually discussed that with my students. You see much more furniture there. You see, a chest of drawers and some more decoration on the walls. But Lady Impey is actually sitting on a footstool, not on the floor, because no European lady would do this, but also not on the chair. So really lowering the distance and talking to her servants almost on eye level, right? But this was a domestic scene as opposed to this formal scene that you have with the Begum. So maybe you can also kind of talk about this, and also the relevance really of the neoclassical style. I mean, I'd be really curious about your interpretation.
Yeah, thanks.
If I may interrupt you a second.
Yes.
When I first saw the interior of the Basilica at Sardhana, I thought I'm inside the Taj Mahal. Because when you look at the altar, all these commesso e pietrature, this is so, I mean, okay, it's basically probably of Italian origin, but it is so well done that it compares, I mean, the execution of the work completely compares to the work done much earlier during Shah Jahan at the Taj Mahal. Another thing, if I may say that, in Indian palaces then, or kamra as it was called in one of the ground plans, the furniture choice was not very big. The furniture that was very important was a kind of bedstead. Later, I mean, for poorer people, it was a charpoy, but otherwise, the climate was not good for more than just wooden chests to keep things. There were no shelves or things like that. That was not visible. And in the families where I lived in Calcutta, in Bengal, which is very humid, most of the furniture was made of steel, like an almirah, where to keep the dresses. So I am not surprised that in the house of Lady Impey, there isn't that much furniture in Calcutta in particular. Meena, please.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for all these questions, and thank you so much, Professor Bautso, for telling me more about this painting. I have not been able to see it myself, and actually, this was given, or this was passed along to me. The painting itself, the image of it was passed along to me by someone else, and so I sort of, as you rightly say, I made a guess of the date, sorry, and but I'm so pleased and to hear that your correction of it, and I will certainly put that in there, and also to hear that that this was in fact the ceremonial entrance of the Raja of Kota to Shah Jahanabad. So I'm really thankful to you and grateful to you, and would love to hear more about this as well. And then the other question that you asked about the Darbar scene. So my interpretation of the Darbar actually comes from, I'm sure you know this, but I'm saying this for the others who don't know this, but the names of almost everybody here are actually recorded. For the Indians, they are on the Kamarband, so we know exactly who every person here is named. Actually, one of the few people who is not named is the Begum herself, and that's what the inscription stands for. It stands as a kind of invocation of her. So my interpretation of this is, again, this idea of how the Begum is, when we think about the fact that the Begum is carrying the name of Walter Reinhardt, who was sort of reviled and really hated by the British. I believe that around this time, when she really is, creating a sort of this allegiance and establishing herself as a ruler, she's really trying to invent a new kind of genealogy for herself, and of course she still carries that name of Samru, but she's really trying to sort of position herself almost as the kind of Samru, the sort of the main Samru, from whom this kind of line of descent then carries on. So her household, as I said, was made up of many women, but including the biracial sisters of Dicember, one of whom marries this Italian Solaroli, and Solaroli then becomes the Marchese of Briona, and there is still a line from that Italian family. But that woman, although she was married to an Italian officer, continued to remain in Parda even after she went to Italy. Her sister Anne also continued to remain in Parda. So they we don't know if it was by choice or by custom or because the Begum enforced Parda for other women in her household. So we don't really have any depictions of them. Georgiana and Anne, so these were David Dice's sisters, were depicted in portraits, in oil paintings. But I have my hunch about that is that happened after they were in Italy. When they moved to Italy with Georgiana's husband, those were commissioned there. So this is really a kind of a sense of her court. So you'll see a Regalini here. He's again an officer in her court. The Munshi sitting at her feet, and she's really trying to sort of establish herself. This is General Jean-Baptiste Ventura, who was again an ally, a very famous officer with Ranjit Singh. And these are those visiting dignitaries that I said are from a kind of a regional court. So to me, this is a way for her to kind of, mark her sort of heirs, her dependent, the genealogical sort of, obviously tree of David Dice's father here, and then really show the sort of, I have another image, which I'm sorry I didn't put in here, but the Royal Collection, the Royal Trust collection in England has a beautiful ivory and wood model of the Begum's Darbar that also shows, it's a miniature model, it's about this big. It shows the Begum surrounded by her kind of, David Dice is not in there, but surrounded by some of her male advisors. So this trope of the Darbar is something that visually seems to be quite sort of something that she kind of continually plays with. And then in another section of the book, I also, where's the Khairullah image? I also talk about this image of the Begum as a kind of it's not really a darbar scene, but definitely the kind of motifs of this kind of balustrade and her sitting on this masnad, holding the hookah, very much a kind of a visual sort of indication of her status as a kind of a darbar woman. So I think that my interpretation of this is that she's really playing on those Mughal tropes of genealogy, but she's doing that to establish a kind of new genealogy for herself, with the sort of, men and kind of allies that she has around her. So that would be my interpretation. And then Mimi, Dr. Schmidt asked this question about furniture, which is super interesting. So the Begum actually did have a throne. She often sat on something like this. So many visitors, her contemporaries, said that, when she was receiving them, she would sit on a masnad, which is essentially just a kind of a raised platform with these kind of cushions. But she did have a chair or a throne, which is actually still in the residence in Sardhana. It was shown to me, and I think, like many of her contemporaries, the Begum sort of used furniture like the footstools depending on who she was receiving or depending on how formal the Natasha Eaton, art historian Natasha Eaton, has talked a lot about this, that in spaces like Lucknow and also in Murshidabad, there would be these grand European palaces that would be built. And when Europeans came in, chairs would be brought out for them, and the Nawabs would sit on chairs or thrones themselves. But then when they left, all of those would be taken out, and then other kinds of furnishings would be brought in, so pillows and rugs and bolsters would be brought in. So these spaces, I think you're right in pointing out that these spaces had a kind of necessarily had to have a kind of mutability to them, because the audiences were so different and so diverse that in some ways a ruler or someone in power had to be quite conscious about the sort of nuances of how things were arranged and how they were sort of how they were kind of displayed. So certainly, I mean, we have accounts of women travelers who go to visit the Begum in her tents. They find her sitting, on this masnad, but then the Begum always asks for chairs to be brought in for her European visitors to the tents. But we have other accounts of her actually sitting on a throne.
Because it also shows respect for different traditions. And I think
Yes.
that kind of, and you even see in certain palace architecture, you have two dining rooms, a European dining room for European guests and, the Indian style of dining room, and even guest houses specifically built for European guests. And I think a lot of this is missing in the current discussions. There's always this kind of, there is only a focus on power hierarchies. And I think this is falling short. We really need to understand these multiple cultures and cultural exchange going on at the time, even between Hindu cultures in Islamic cultures, in architectural forms and aesthetic forms as well. It's important to consider this. This is really missing from the debate.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
There was one more answer from John. I think he had to leave, but I'd just like to bring it up quickly. He was wondering about, we have a few more minutes left before we come to the close at 5 more minutes. Namely, do we know anything about the craftsman? Because usually, everyone who works on India, it's very difficult to know even the name of the architects. It's great that we have it here, but do we know anything about the craftsmen who were involved?
Well, actually, we do. We know that. As I said, Regalini was the architect of the church, and I'm not sure what happens. Well, actually, I am. Regalini has a falling out with David Dice, who's the heir. So he's not involved in the, as far as I can tell from the archive, he's not involved in the design of the final mansion at Sardhana. So I'm not sure who sort of whose architectural vision besides the Begums is really kind of operative there. But it's really interesting because David Dice kept a very detailed or somewhat detailed diary when he was still living in India before he goes to England and Europe. And in that, he talks about actually paying the contractors and the mimars of this final mansion in Sardhana. So he talks about the fact that there were 2 head superintendents, and then there were about 3 contractors below them, and he gave them all, during Holi, he gave them all like shaguns, or actually the Begum gave them shaguns, and sort of congratulated them on the building of the house. And such, or thank them for the building of the house. I also wanted to say that Professor Bautza said this about the altar of Pietradura, and there's I found some descriptions or some information that the Begum actually had craftsmen from Jaipur come to do that Pietradura work. So these are sort of contemporaries who are writing about the thing, and it does not seem far-fetched to me that she would have had that kind of, she would have wanted that kind of patronage. So we do know that there was, some sort of traffic. And then the Begum continued to have, this is conjecture on my part, but the Begum, for instance, had very strong connections to Delhi. So whenever she had these, like the Christmas balls and things like that in Sardhana, she would get dancers, nachnis from Delhi to come, and very famous troops to come and perform and stay in her estate for 3 days while they performed and stuff. So I find it, it is not improbable, I think, that she had connections or she sought out craftspersons. I didn't get to talk about this bathroom, this wonderful bathroom in her final residence in Sardhana, but that is also another kind of really interesting form of plaster work that's, again, I haven't been able to find much information on who made it, but this kind of very fine sort of painted and gilt work on the ceilings of what was actually an indoor bathroom, is really interesting.
The hammam, right? So this was the hammam. So in a way, you have again these kind of very different worlds coming together under one.
Right. So the hammam, but it's also this idea that the hammams are usually outside, and she brings it inside and gives it this kind of really sort of stately look, right? Which is super interesting to me, but also the kind of fineness of those work, which also makes me think that and you can see this is the sort of I mean, dressing room that leads to the main hammam, but you can see the colored glass and such, which is, it's just really, really, fine work and very detailed work. So
then maybe one thing we should also consider about craftsmen, it's not only finding the craftsmen, but being allowed to use and utilize these craftsmen from a courtly context also shows her importance, because it wouldn't have been possible otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And also I think, it shows her taste and her kind of, her sophistication. I think she was, I make the claim that she was visually a very sophisticated woman, right? So I think that, that's part of the story here, that, it's not just about power, that there's a lot of these sort of affects, I think, visual affects that really give us some clue as to kind of how elevated her tastes were.
Thank you. With this, we are coming into the end. I would also like to announce that the Center for Historic Houses is planning a conference on the history of collecting in India. It's an important topic, but we found that kind of India hasn't been featured so much. We are planning to do this with Kavita Singh. So anyone who's interested and is doing research in this area, please contact us. So thank you very, very much. It was really fascinating, wonderful. And there is the YouTube recording of this on our channel, Center for Historic Houses. So you're able to revisit it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Bautzer, and thank you, Dr. Schmidt, for inviting me. And if anyone is interested in carrying on the conversation, please feel free to email me. I'm very happy to talk about the Begum ad nauseum.
Bye.
Bye.